that are archived and for future reference. So at this point, I'd like to begin by thanking our distinguished speaker, Denise Lieberman, for taking time from her busy schedule to join us today. I'd also like to introduce representatives from the 3 organizations that are co-sponsoring Rock the Vote today. Cheryl Adelstein, Deputy Director, Jewish Community Relations Council, St. Louis. Michelle Steinberg, Membership Director, Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice, and she's going to help with the Q&A. And Jen Bernstein, Advocacy Manager, the National Council of Jewish Women, St. Louis. And now Jen will introduce today's.
We are so lucky to have Denise here today. She is, if not, she is the foremost expert on this issue, if not only in St. Louis, but probably in the country. So I'm just thrilled to be able to introduce her today. Denise Lieberman is a nationally recognized voting rights lawyer who has been on the front lines of voting debates in Missouri and around the country for more than 20 years. She serves as Director and General Counsel of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, which leads collaborative legal and policy efforts to protect the right to vote in Missouri. She has brought lawsuits challenging strict photo ID laws to ensure safe voting amid the pandemic, and is currently fighting a new restrictive voting law in the state. Denise has testified before Congress on the Voting Rights Act and previously served as the director of the Voter Protection Program at the Advancement Project National Office in Washington, D.C., a racial justice organization. Denise is also faculty director of the Voter Access and Engagement Initiative at Washington University in St. Louis, where she is an adjunct professor of law and political science. Denise has been at the forefront of voting rights debates in her home state of Missouri and across the country, helping to lead campaigns to advance voting reform in Congress, and as a consultant with the Brennan Center for Justice, fight the spate of restrictive voting proposals in the states following the 2020 elections. Denise is a previous recipient of the National Human Rights Award from TRUA, the Rabbinic Call for Human Rights, and the Hannah G. Solomon Award from the National Council of Jewish Women, St. Louis. Denise is a member of Central Reform Congregation in St. Louis. And welcome, Denise, and thank you so much for doing this for us today.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you so much to all of the sponsoring organizations. I'm so honored and delighted to be here with everyone today to rock the vote. I am going to share some slides as part of my presentation, but I just really want to thank all of you who tuned in today because I'm really not exaggerating when I say that we are in the midst of a crisis in our democracy, and it's really going to take all of us to step up to ensure that everybody's voice is able to be heard. And it is precisely in moments like these, precisely during times where we feel like our rights are under attack from so many angles, that our right to vote is so critically important. And whatever issue brought you here today, whatever issue is weighing deeply on your mind, whether you are fretting about yet more gun violence in our schools, about the future of reproductive rights for women, about LGBTQ rights, about the rights of our trans students in schools, about the state of our environment, about jobs, about access to healthcare. All of these things hang in the balance right now. And all of them are undergirded by our right to vote. So I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, and we're going to get started. So I really want to thank the participating organizations and really want to just make a note. And I included in the bio for today my Jewish affiliation because, and I know Women's Voices is ecumenical, but the other organizations, the Mirowitz Center, Jewish Community Relations Council, National Council of Jewish Women, have been such strong advocates of the right to vote. And that follows a deep and rich tradition in Judaism of protecting the vote. We know that rabbis were central and critical to marching with Martin Luther King in the fight for civil rights. And right here at home today, our own organizations that stand up for Jewish values in St. Louis, including Jewish Community Relations Council, have been proactive in speaking out about the importance of the right to vote. And I just want to note how critical this is, because at the end of the day, our faith organizations, our faith communities, Jewish communities that are working to advance Tikkun Olam, the repair of the world, really help uplift this issue in a critical way at moments like this. Our fight over voting rights has become mired in political controversy, in partisanship, unnecessarily so, because the truth of the matter is that this fight is not about partisan politics as much as what you see on the news is suggesting to you. The truth is, we don't win this fight unless we can elevate our message above the partisan fray. It's not about partisan politics. This is truly about justice. This is truly about morality. This is truly about a call to recognize the basic human dignity of all people. Why? Because access to the right to vote is how we, in a public way, acknowledge your existence, acknowledge literally that you count. And so when your right to vote is denied or abridged, it quite literally is saying you don't count. And that is a deeply damaging sentiment to all of us. And the truth is, our right to vote is what allows us the ability to be free, to be autonomous, to make decisions about our future. And so when we see this right constrained, when we see this right abridged, it is a denial to all. It is a denial of democracy when all who are eligible cannot have a seat at the table. So I really am grateful to be part of this program today. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition is a nonpartisan statewide network of advocates who work to protect the freedom to vote in Missouri. And this coalition is broad. It includes nearly 60 affiliated organizations, including the co-sponsoring organizations today on this program. And we work to advance the right to vote, particularly for voters of color, low-wage workers, young voters, seniors, voters with disabilities, English plus communities, and sexual minorities who face the greatest barriers to the ballot, and for whom efforts to make voting harder are targeted. And we advance this mission through 4 buckets of work. That includes policy advocacy. So we anchor tracking of voting legislation in the Missouri General Assembly. We're going to hear a lot more about that in a minute. We also do this through legal advocacy and litigation. We coordinate strategic litigation to advance the right to vote in Missouri and to target discriminatory voting laws. We also do this through voter education and engagement. And this is a really critical piece because so much of our ability to exercise our right to vote depends on our ability to know what our rights are. And thanks to so many of you, and thanks to so many of the members of the sponsoring organizations today, we are helping get the word out so people have access to accurate, trusted information so that they can effectively exercise their right to vote. And finally, our signature service program, the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition, coordinates nonpartisan election protection efforts in the state of Missouri in collaboration with so many partners. And this includes the 866 Our Vote election protection hotline that is answered live on election day by real attorneys in the state of Missouri. complemented by hundreds and hundreds of monitors monitoring the polls to provide assistance in real time so that no voter has to leave a polling place without casting a ballot. We encourage you to get involved in this work. There is really a lane for everybody, whatever the issue is, whatever constituencies you work with. There is important space for you in this fight. So we urge you to join us. Sign up for our action alerts by texting MOVPC to 66866 or send us an email at info@movpc.org, or you can sign up directly at bit.ly/protectmovoters. So before I go further, could I ask folks if you're not speaking to mute your line? I am hearing a little bit of background noise. And I just want to make sure that everybody can hear. Is it possible to mute the lines that are not muted?
I believe they're working on it on the back end, yes.
Okay, thanks. So first, before we jump into kind of the state of affairs of voting rights, one of the things I was asked to talk about today is voter registration. And that's really important because we have elections coming up this year, everybody. And it's going to take all of us to make sure that every eligible voter is registered and able to cast their ballots on election day. So we have primary elections coming up later this summer. It's hard to believe it's already summer, but here we are and they are coming on fast. So for the August 2 primary elections, that voter registration deadline is July 6th. That is coming up in just a month, and it will be here before you know it. So please help ensure that your members, that your friends, that your neighbors, that your family members are registered to vote, because we know that the number one reason that people don't participate is that they're not registered. The truth of the matter is that there are 40 million eligible but unregistered voters in the United States, or people who need to update their registrations in order for them to be able to cast ballots. And you may not realize that you need to update your registration. These numbers just give a short snapshot of just this community just in the last year. In 2021 alone, over 4 million people turned 18 and are now eligible to vote. As many as 30 million Americans moved. And when you move, especially in Missouri, at least right now, you have to update your voter registration by the registration deadline. An average of 2 million Americans will get married or change their names. You may not know, but if you've changed your name, you need to update your voter registration as well. And millions may be purged from the voter rolls. This is a process that happens after federal elections that has been underway this past year. And so we want to make sure everybody remembers to get registered, check your registration. So if you are on this list, you need to consider registering or re-registering to vote, updating your registration. If you're going to be 18 by election day, if you've newly become a US citizen, if your name has changed, if you've moved to Missouri, if you've moved within Missouri, if you've recently gotten off probation or parole in Missouri, once you are off probation and parole, you are eligible to register and vote. Maybe you haven't voted in several election cycles, or maybe you've never been registered. All of these reasons should propel you to encourage somebody to register to vote. And if you're having any voter registration activities, we have these great voter registration palm cards. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition put them together, and we'd be happy to make them available for you. We also have them in Spanish, and these will help ensure that everybody gets on the rolls. So I'm going to switch gears here. It's really important for everybody to be on the rolls right now because our right to vote is under attack, and it is going to take all of us, all of us stepping out, all of us exercising our right to vote, all of us exercising our voice in order to combat these threats. We are going in, starting tomorrow, to the congressional hearings on the January 6th attack on our nation's capital. Across the country, there will be congressional hearing watch parties, including one here in the St. Louis area, where Jennifer Lohman, the chair of the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition's Anti-Disinformation Committee, is going to be speaking. You can check out and find local events at January 6th, watchevents.com. And I'm reflecting on this now, not just because these hearings start tomorrow, but because this is a fundamental inflection point for our democracy in our nation's history. All of us, of course, remember the violent and deadly attack on our Capitol and on our democratic process last January 6th, egged on by Missouri's own Senator Josh Hawley. We can't forget that famous fist bump. And the spate of disinformation that led directly to the calls to overturn the duly held elections in 2020 propelled a spate of restrictive voting laws that continues to this day. In 2021 alone, there were over 420 restrictive voting bills, 34 new laws passed in 19 states. This year, over 350 restrictive voting bills, and more are still getting passed, including right here in the state of Missouri. And not only do these measures trend to targeting the very practices that were responsible for the record turnout, particularly of African American and young voters in 2020. But these measures are designed and targeted to make it more difficult for those very populations to be able to continue to vote. So what we're seeing across the country, for example, are attacks on voting by mail, efforts to enshrine stricter voter ID requirements like we just passed in Missouri that disproportionately impact voters of color and young voters, in our seniors, and our voters with disabilities. Efforts to make it illegal to help voters who need assistance. Again, most marginalized communities are communities that already face the greatest hurdles to the ballot. And all of these things are included in the omnibus bill that was passed by the Missouri General Assembly just less than a month ago here in Missouri. Senator Raphael Warnock from Georgia has called this a massive and unabashed assault on voting rights, unlike anything we have seen since the Jim Crow era. And what's worse is that not only are we seeing a massive and unprecedented attack on voting rights and voter access, particularly for communities of color, but these measures have done something more and even more sinister, moving the debate from just this issue of voter suppression to elevating the delegitimization of the elections process itself, something we call election sabotage or election subversion. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy. When people lose faith in our democratic processes, then those processes no longer can serve us. And we know that these processes work. The late John Lewis, Congressman John Lewis, said that the right to vote is precious, almost sacred. It is the most effective non-violent tool to affect change in a democracy. And so when we see trends going towards using disinformation to delegitimize the democratic process itself, it really underpins and undergirds the whole foundation on which a peaceful democracy rests. And these fears are not unfounded, unfortunately. This attack, not just on voters, but on the whole process, has led to an attack on election workers themselves and threats against election workers for doing their jobs. This is Brad Raffensperger, the Republican Secretary of State of Georgia, who, after refusing to rig the Georgia election results in 2020, after a request from former President Trump, began to receive death threats. And you can see on the right side of the screen text messages that his wife received, threatening to kill his family very slowly. I pray for your death every day, etc. And in fact, a recent report from the Brennan Center for Justice that was released a couple months ago found that across the country, 1 in 6 election officials have experienced threats. 30% know election workers who have left their jobs because they're concerned about their safety. And this study, and it was a poll, a nationwide poll of election officials that was conducted by the Brennan Center earlier this year, found that approximately 1 in 5, 20% of local election officials say that they plan to resign before the 2024 election cycle. And we already see efforts underway by those who would sabotage our elections to rig this process and place partisan actors in these roles who will then be controlling the levers of democracy. And unfortunately, legislation that was passed this year in Missouri does help move that process along. We saw this year in 2022, not only over 350 bills that would affect access to the ballot, but dozens of bills that would actually undermine that election process itself, including right here in Missouri. So I want to get us to where we are here in Missouri. This is a photo from Missouri Voter Protection Coalition's Voting Rights Lobby Day. I think if you look closely, you'll see some of you in this photo. I see Cheryl there in the front row. I see a number of other folks who were here. Many of the organizations sponsoring today's program were co-sponsors of this Lobby Day. So we're gonna talk a little bit about what happened here in Missouri and where we go next. Well, it was a big year for voting. Like I said, across the country, over 350 restrictive voting bills. And here in Missouri, we were tracking about 36 bills that would make it harder for voters to cast a ballot in Missouri. They included thematically attacks on the citizen initiative process, efforts to enshrine photo ID requirements to vote, efforts to restrict voting by mail, efforts to undermine our elections. And we kept track of these bills on a regular basis and provided updates in real time to our members through our action alerts to try and get people to weigh in, to testify. And that's not always easy, particularly in the Missouri Senate, which requires people to be present in person in order to testify. They don't accept any online testimony. And they were hardly following safe COVID procedures. Yet many of you weighed in, dozens and dozens and dozens of you weighed in and made your faces seen at the Capitol every week. There were hearings on these voting bills to make sure that your testimonies were recorded for the record. And many legislators stepped up to the plate. While we have a mixed bag in terms of what we landed with, we know that our legislators, particularly these 3 who served on the Missouri House Elections Committee, faced this assault on voting rights every single Wednesday when they met again and again, faced with testimonies that were rooted in disinformation about non-existent voter fraud. And so we want to thank That's State Representative Kevin Windham, State Representative David Tyson Smith, State Representative Joe Adams, and off to the side, but you can't see her, is State Representative Donna Behringer, who we all gave thank you cards to because these assaults were quite wretched. Okay, so where did we land? The session ended. We've got some good news and we've got some bad news. It's sort of the good, the bad, and the ugly. First, the good news. We saved the citizen initiative process in Missouri. And that is very good news. There were over 24 bills that would have made it harder for everyday citizens to have their voices heard through the citizen initiative process by making it harder for groups to get measures on the ballot and by increasing the threshold for such measures to pass to a nearly impossible level, would have been the highest threshold in the country. And thanks to a filibuster by members of the Missouri Senate, this measure that was poised for passage did not make it through. And so Missouri's storied citizen initiative process lives to see another day, thanks in large part to the efforts of so many of you. And here's just another photo of some of you who were at the Voting Rights Lobby Day to stand up for the citizen initiative process and make your voices heard to those senators who listened and filibustered this measure. So now the bad and the ugly. The voter suppression bill, House Bill 1878, did pass out of the legislature. The bad part of this bill is that it enshrines discriminatory photo ID requirements to vote. That's the bad. The ugly is that this bill, which started out as a 7-page photo ID bill, turned into an 80-page omnibus voter suppression measure that targets the access to the ballot in a dizzying array of ways. That will make it harder, not just to cast a ballot, but it will make it illegal for groups to get paid for voter registration, make it illegal to help people get absentee ballots, make it easier for the Secretary of State to purge voters from the voter rolls, make it easier for the state to invite private auditors in for cyber ninja type programs in Missouri. This is very concerning. The Missouri Voter Protection Coalition has prioritized this bill. It was our top priority bill this year, and we have condemned passage of House Bill 1878. This measure, however, is not yet law. This measure is currently sitting on Governor Parson's desk. Governor Parson had a signing ceremony yesterday where he signed nearly a dozen bills into law. This one was not one of them. It is still on his desk. He still has the opportunity to do the right thing and veto this measure. We have a petition located at bit.ly/veto1878, and we urge you to sign this petition and join the growing number of Missourians calling on Governor Parson to veto this bill. So briefly, here's what this bill does. We're going to start with the bad, the photo ID part. The photo ID part of this bill is bad enough. It enshrines strict photo ID requirements to vote in Missouri. And this is something, if you've been following voting rights in Missouri, that lawmakers have been trying to do unsuccessfully for 15 years. And each time they do it, the courts tell them they can't, that it's unconstitutional. Yet they think they found a workaround this year. We're going to take them to court and we'll see. But this measure would eliminate non-photo forms of ID that Missourians currently use to verify their identities at the polls. And so I really want to make clear here that this measure is not about whether Missourians have to show ID to vote. Missouri is already a voter ID state, so don't let the disinformation fool you. We're not talking about should voters have to verify their identity? We already have to. Currently in Missouri law, every single voter has to show ID when they vote every single time they vote. We already have voter ID. The difference is that currently we can use a range of forms of ID, including the voter registration card you get from the election authority, the card that the election authority says verifies that you are in fact a valid and registered voter. That card would be eliminated under this bill. So would a student ID from a college or university located in Missouri. We know so many of our students, especially those where there are polling places on campus, like at Mizzou, at WashU, at SLU, at UMKC, rely on those student IDs to do everything, and it allows these students to be able to vote. These are eliminated, leaving just the kind of ID that you have to get at the DMV. And that's why this is a problem. There's a lot of misinformation about photo ID laws. People say, well, come on, everybody has an ID. It's not that hard to get. Well, and the truth is, most people do have a state ID, like a driver's license or a non-driver's license, but about 10% of people don't. And for many, that ID might be expired. So currently in Missouri, if you're a senior and you no longer drive, but maybe you still have that driver's license, you can use that expired license to cast your ballot. No longer will that expired ID be allowable. Or maybe you live on the border between St. Louis and Illinois, or St. Louis and Kansas. You recently moved. Your license is still valid from Illinois or Kansas. You can currently use that to vote. Not under this measure. You could only show a non-expired Missouri or federally issued ID. And you can only get that ID at the DMV. And again, that's where the problem comes in. Because not everybody can get to the DMV. In fact, not every county in Missouri even has a DMV office. Many are not open evenings or weekends. Many are not located on public transportation routes. Well, because their primary job is to give people driver's licenses. They mostly work with people who drive. So for people who don't, they're going to have difficulty even getting in the door. And then once you get in the door, it can be a bureaucratic maze if you don't have all the underlying documents necessary to get a state ID, like a certified birth certificate or legal documentation if your name has changed since birth. This is a true story. I just took my mom to get a state ID because I'm taking her out of town. Her license is expired and she's always used her expired license to vote, but I had to go get her a new ID. And I brought her birth certificate, which doesn't include the name that is listed on her ID. She was born in 1931. She's 91 years old. It has her maiden name on it. They wanted to see an original copy of her marriage license from 1949. She doesn't even have a state marriage license from the state of Missouri. What she has is a ketubah. Right, from I believe B'nai Amunah, that's written in Hebrew. Nothing, there's no paper trail that will allow her to actually get a fully functioning ID in the state of Missouri. And many, many other people have these barriers as well. Disproportionately seniors, people with disabilities who may not drive, young people who move around a lot who may not drive, people who rely on public transportation, low-wage workers who would have to take a day off without pay to get to that office during those limited working hours. And that's one of the reasons that the numbers of voters who don't have a non-expired ID in Missouri is over 200,000. And those barriers are some of the reasons that the Missouri Supreme Court has previously concluded that a photo ID requirement violates the right to vote. But this measure, I told you, it's the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now we're in the ugly part.
That's okay. That's okay.
I'm leaving.
Okay. Okay. Call me when you get back. and
I
I'll-
think we're getting a little background noise. I'm wondering if we can mute the line.
Brittany, make sure you got your key to unlock the cage.
Sorry, I think we're hearing somebody's phone conversation. So now we're at the ugly. This measure does more. If it was just photo ID, it would be bad enough, as hopefully you have come to see. But this measure does so much more. It in the last few weeks of the session added all of these other provisions and more. I didn't even have room on this slide to add all of the provisions this bill includes. But of particular concern is a couple of measures that I just want to highlight briefly. One, the purges. This measure gives new authority to the Secretary of State and gives some broad discretion to audit local election authorities at his discretion and determine if he thinks they have properly removed voters who should be removed from the rolls. And if he doesn't, he can, at his discretion, order people removed from the rolls. Now you may say, well, if people need to be removed from the rolls, if they've died, if they've moved, that's a good thing. We should clean up the rolls. We should clean up the rolls. And there's federal laws that mandate how that works and mandate rules to make sure that it's not done too close to an election and to make sure that you are not wrongly removing the wrong person. And unfortunately, there is significant data that shows when these rules are not followed, when these processes are not followed, valid voters get wrongly purged from the rolls, disproportionately racial and ethnic minorities. Just look at the state of Georgia. Former Secretary of State Brian Kemp purged 1.2 million people in the state of Georgia going into those 2018 midterm elections when he was up against Stacey Abrams for governor. And they were disproportionately well over 50% people of color. This measure also would affect voter registration. This is a piece that will also affect many of you who may volunteer, do voter registration, or maybe you work for an organization that does voter registration. Organizations like JCRC, like NCJW, like Merowitz Center, like Women's Voices have staff that help coordinate these activities. The League of Women Voters has staff. This measure would prohibit anybody from being paid to do voter registration, which means that if you are an organization that has staff that coordinates voter registration drives, you could be in trouble under this measure. It would make it an election offense, a class 3 election offense. It doesn't mean that you're prohibited from doing voter registration. What it means is that nobody can be paid, so that all voter registration under this measure will have to be volunteer, organized, and driven, which means it's going to be incredibly difficult for organizations to get their civic engagement goals met. It also requires, even for volunteers, that if you intend on registering 10 or more people in any given election cycle, meaning, are you going to sit at a table for 2 hours? You're likely to get 10 people. You have to register with the state as a voter registration solicitor. And again, under penalty of criminal offense if you don't. So this is really a deterrent to voter registration. Similarly, this measure would make it illegal to help somebody with an absentee ballot application by pre-filling any of the pieces. Even makes it illegal to give anybody a blank absentee ballot application, even though these applications are widely available on the internet. It eliminates residency requirements for challengers, allowing outsiders to come in, potentially intimidate voters at the polls. And it requires hand-marked paper ballots in all cases, which could impede the ability of some voters with disabilities to cast an independent ballot, which they can do now using those machines. This is a lot, and there's a lot more. I'll be happy to answer more during the Q&A part of this session. But in the meantime, I want to encourage you to sign the petition urging Governor Parson to veto this measure. I want to give a shout out to Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice for making this great art to promote this petition to Governor Parson. They've got a great toolkit that you can help spread the word, because we will need to get all these signatures to the governor's desk later this week. I want to conclude with a short video that I am going to share my screen now and share sound, and I believe this should work. Hang on a second. And tell me if you don't hear once we play.
My name is Joy Lieberman. I live in St. Louis, Missouri. I voted in every election since 1952. I believe that's 60 years. My involvement with education was almost accidental. I'm not a teacher. I'm not an educator. I was a very active parent, and when the school district was going through a very traumatic time, I figured, hey, I'll submit myself to this. They won't choose me. And they did. And I spent 24 years on the Board of Education.
My name is Emmanuel Ortiz. I live in St. Louis, Missouri. I've been a registered voter since the early 80s. Okay, the poster on the wall is of me playing with my band, the Son of Star Child Band. We had an opportunity to play a lot of places and open up for a lot of people. First started off playing the drums when I was a kid. Eventually, I made it to the front mic, and I am a front man, as you can see. Cheese.
Well, there's a problem on my birth certificate. The name everyone knows me by, Joy Lieberman. Joy is not my first name, and it's not on my birth certificate. And I discovered that when I was in my mid-40s, thought nothing of it. It was a non-issue until this whole matter of photo IDs reared its head. And I realized that the next time I have to renew my driver's license and present this birth certificate, I'm going to be in big trouble, probably not able to vote.
Everybody's got something they got to go through in life, something that they have to deal with. My test happens to be multiple sclerosis. I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis in 2006, I believe. Some people can't get a state ID because they're in a nursing home like myself. And sometimes you're not able to just get up and give me a call and just go get your ID. You pretty much need to get help. Everybody who's disabled should be a registered voter and being able to vote.
My parents were the first generation in each of their family to be born here. And I'll tell you, they impressed upon me how important it was to vote. And when I thought my right to vote was going to be infringed upon, I was furious. This country fought a war so we wouldn't be taxed without representation. Now, if I lose the right to vote, will the state of Missouri deny my taxes? I don't think so.
Voting means a lot to me because of the fact that my voice is being heard. And I believe that everybody should be able to have their voice heard.
I am an American citizen. It's my right and my duty to participate.
Just because I'm in a wheelchair doesn't mean I can't stand up for my right to vote.
This is your country. You deserve a say-so into who's governing it and how it's being governed
No matter what,
against any odds.
November 6th, I'm voting.
November 6th, I am voting.
So that was a video. I think some of you saw. It was my mother, who was a plaintiff in a prior challenge to a Missouri photo ID request. And by the way, the opening scene was at Central Reform Congregation, which is where she used to work. So this has been a battle we've been fighting here in Missouri for years and years, and it continues with the passage of House Bill 1878. I invite you to join us. And I want to just conclude by, first of all, thanking all of you who've been part of this fight for so long, and know that we've got a ways to go. But when we stand up and exercise our voice, we will win. So I encourage you to join our efforts, sign up for our action alerts, and join our weekly calls every Monday at 10 a.m. Thank you so much. And I am absolutely delighted to have some time for question and discussion.
Thank you, Denise. We have a variety of questions, and I'll just start and you can answer as you see fit. The first few all relate to HB 1878. One is, what are the legal challenges against HB 1878? When would it go into effect, and when will you file suit?
That's a good question. So this measure, like I said, is not yet in effect. So the governor has not signed this bill into law. It is not currently law. If he has until just around the July 4th holiday to decide whether he's going to sign or veto. That's why we really urge you to sign this veto letter. If he signs it into law, or if he does nothing and it just goes into law, it would become effective on August 28th. So it would not be in effect for the August 2nd primary elections, but would be in effect presumably for the November elections. We are working with our legal partners to develop litigation. It may actually be 2 lawsuits, one to challenge the photo ID and one to challenge the registration and purge and absentee ballot provisions that we would ask the court to block the law from going in effect while the legal challenge is proceeding. It's called a preliminary injunction. Now, we can't file that case until he actually signs the bill into law, because at this point, there is no law, right? It's just a bill, it's sitting on his desk. So his signing of the measure into law would make it right for that case to move forward. So we are working with several legal partners, including the ACLU, on getting the lawsuits together in anticipation of filing sometime in July.
Can you explain if there are places outside of the DMV someone can get a photo ID? And what is required for someone to get a photo ID?
Oh, that's such a great question. It is harder than you think to get an ID, although maybe not. If any of you have gone to renew your licenses or IDs lately, I had to do so this year. It was really quite an effort. I mean, I showed up with a file folder this thick of documents and still didn't have everything I needed. So no, the problem with this measure is that it limits the kind of ID to that which you have to get at the DMV. The DMV is the only place you can get a state ID in the state of Missouri. That's the problem, right? Because there's barriers to getting there, and then there's barriers to getting those IDs. In order to get an ID, you have to provide underlying documentation, if you don't currently have one, underlying documentation of your identity and your residency, including like a certified birth certificate, like with the raised seal, like legal documents like a marriage license or a divorce decree if your name has changed since birth. That's one of the reasons women are disproportionately affected by photo ID laws. Documentation of your it can include social security, yes, or adoption papers, naturalization papers. There's a whole list that are on the state's website. One of our partners, Christine Dragonette, who runs an ID acquisition program at St. Francis Xavier College Church, did a terrific program for us 2 weeks ago on Monday on the processes for getting IDs. And we do have a 30-minute recording of that presentation, as well as her slides for those that might want a little bit deeper dive. It can really be a hassle as well for people who may have errors or discrepancies on those underlying documents, which is true for many of the people I've represented in cases who are seniors. You saw my mom's birth certificate, it was handwritten. It was hardly legible. That's true for many, many people of her generation. And sometimes what that means is that some of the dates or letters get juxtaposed. I represented a woman in North Carolina who just had a small misspelling on her name, the way her name presented on her birth certificate compared to her social security, compared to her voter registration. She had to go to 10 different government offices, including the recorder of deeds and the registrars, just to reconcile those. I've had clients that have had to go to court to get a court-ordered legal name change in order to reconcile a minor discrepancy or barrier. And yes, a passport, a non-expired passport or non-expired military ID will also constitute valid forms of ID, but we know statistically that for people that don't have a state ID, they are highly, highly, highly unlikely to have a non-expired passport, and the passport is much more expensive to get. Now, I will say under this bill, the state does have to provide you a non-driver ID for voting without cost, but only if you say the magic words. You have to say that you need that ID for voting and that you cannot afford to pay the $13, $14 or whatever it is for the state ID.
Thank you, Denise. We have a few more. How do you respond to Chief Justice Roberts' claim that so much has changed and thus there's no reason for maintaining certain parts of the Voting Rights Act?
Oh, yes, yes. I didn't even really get into that. One of the challenges here, and one of the reasons we're seeing this spate of voting bills here in Missouri and around the country, is that federal protections for voting rights have been eroded and eroded a lot over the last decade, starting back in 2013 with a Supreme Court decision called Shelby v. Holder that gutted a key piece of the Voting Rights Act that was responsible for blocking discriminatory voting laws before they went into effect. And then just last year in 2021, a case called Bronovich versus DNC further weakened the Voting Rights Act, making it much harder to be able to prove that a voting practice is discriminatory and should be struck down. And that's one reason why the Missouri Voter Protection Coalition and many advocates around the country were fighting for federal legislation, including the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act that would restore the protections of the Voting Rights Act, and the Freedom to Vote Act that would make photo ID requirements illegal, guarantee access to early voting, ensure that people were able to cast ballots on election day, and make election sabotage illegal. And unfortunately, while both of these bills did pass out of the House of Representatives earlier this year, they both got stalled in the United States Senate, thanks to the use of the filibuster. And so we now have this weakened federal protection for voting rights that has opened this Pandora's box in states like Missouri and Georgia and Texas and Florida and North Carolina and Michigan and other places where we can't go to these federal courts anymore. John Roberts, in the Shelby decision in gutting the Voting Rights Act, said that things had changed since 1965. And of course, at that time, we had an African-American president and an African-American attorney general who were defending that case. But what is so very clear is that these assaults on our democratic process had not gone away. They had just been protected by those federal laws. And without those federal protections, what we have seen is an onslaught, an absolute onslaught targeting access to the ballot since that time. And the way that we fight back is the way that we fought back in the past, by exercising our voices, by speaking out, and by making sure that each and every one of us goes to the polls and exercises our right to vote, because that right belongs to each and every one of us. It is an individual right. They cannot take it away from us, and we can't let them.
Denise, you didn't realize that segues perfectly to the next question. Second Amendment rights are often protected and expanded as a constitutional right. How can those in support of voting rights successfully make the comparison that voting rights must also be protected and expanded? People must be able to exercise their constitutional right to vote as easy as their Second Amendment rights.
Yeah. Well, you know, well, we won't get too deep into the Second Amendment and what I believe is not an accurate reading of the phrases and clauses of that provision, especially as we sit here with organizations that are advocating so ardently for gun reform. It is so sorely needed in this country. The right to vote is fundamental, and it is the right that is preservative of all other rights. As far back as 1886, the United States Supreme Court said that the right to vote is fundamental because it is preservative of all other rights. If you do not have the right to vote, you can't advocate on issues related to the Second Amendment, whether that means advocating for gun control or a more expansive reading of the Second Amendment. You can't advocate for access to healthcare. You can't advocate for women's reproductive justice. You cannot advocate for LGBT rights or environmental justice or education reform because you don't have a public voice. The vote is the way we speak publicly in this country, and that is the reason it is preservative of all other rights. And this is, of course, true across the political spectrum. It affects everybody. For all of us to be able to have a say in our communities, in our societies, and how we live, we have to have that right to vote. Otherwise, the conversation can't even get off the table.
Thank you. We want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I have just one more question and then we'll close out the events. And this is referring back to the bill on Governor Parsons' desk. Will volunteers still be able to register voters at high schools and colleges if there is a violation of the paid staff provision when registering voters? Who would technically be violation? The organization as a whole, the volunteers, or a specific employee?
Yeah, that's a good question. It appears it's not entirely clear. It may not come as much surprise to you that not everything that is drafted by the General Assembly, especially amendments that are added very, very late at night, may not be the bastions of clarity that we would like them to be. But what this measure says is no one shall be paid or otherwise compensated, and that it's a class 3 election offense. So presumably the party who was getting paid. But if an organization was paying them, you could imagine a prosecutor potentially saying, you're in violation of this for paying somebody. To answer the broader question, this measure does not limit the ability of volunteers to do voter registration, but requires them to register and file paperwork with the state that has to be faxed in, it has to be signed, an actual signed piece of paper saying that you are doing voter registration as a registration solicitor. And failure to submit that paperwork, it is a class 3 election offense for that volunteer. And so what that means is, like, you know, it's going to be a deterrent to someone that might say, hey, I'm happy to sit at this table and volunteer for 2 hours. Well, now you're going to have to do this paperwork. You're going to have to find a fax machine. You're going to have to sign a legal document, sending it into the state. There are going to be people for whom they say, you know what, I'm really not wanting to sign on to all of that. And at the end of the day, it's going to be a deterrent if we're not able to get it struck down. I believe that provision violates the First Amendment, by the way, and that it is also vague and overbroad because some of its implications are unclear.
Thank you so much. I'm going to hand this off to Cheryl, who's going to close our program. And we want to thank you all for attending on what is turning out to be a beautiful day. You took the time to be at your desk and learn about voting rights and voting advocacy in Missouri. And we're so very grateful for all of your time.
Hello, everyone. I'm Cheryl Adelstein with the Jewish Community Relations Council. And we just, again, want to thank Denise, who is such a joy to work with and coordinated with us and rearranged vacations and other things to be with us here today. So on behalf of the Mirowitz Center, Women's Voices Raised for Social Justice, National Council of Jewish Women, and the Jewish Community Relations Council, thank you again for being here. Stay engaged. If you got this notice, then you've somehow connected with one of our organizations. And we will do everything we can to keep you up to date on voter access in Missouri. So thank you, and everybody have a great day.